These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe, there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power. Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story. I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? Florence. Home to one of the oldest art galleries in the world, the Uffizi. Every year, millions of people flock to see masterpieces by Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Artists so famous they're known by their first names alone. But there's a painting here that's more copied, caricatured, and argued about than any other. And it's not by any of them. It's a painting that arouses physical reactions. In 2018, one man even had a heart attack in front of it. It's one of the most famous female images in the world, and one of the oddest. This is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Now then, full disclosure. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, I have not been able to go myself and stand in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. As it happens, Botticelli's Birth of Venus is a painting I have seen in the flesh plenty of times. And although, luckily, it has not yet given me a heart attack, I can report that it packs a powerful emotional punch. It's a simple enough looking composition telling the story of the birth of the Roman goddess Venus out at sea, and shows her wafting to shore as only goddesses may on a giant scallop shell blown by the god of wind, Zephyr. Simple or not, it's heart-stoppingly radiant. Yet this masterpiece by Botticelli hasn't always been one of the world's most celebrated and most visited canvases. In fact, surprisingly, for more than 300 years, it was effectively packed away. And to understand why, we have to go back to the period when it was first made, not the period of birth, but of rebirth, or to give it the fancy French name, the Renaissance. This world-shifting cultural, artistic and scientific upheaval turned Europe on its head in the 15th century. And at the heart of that radical transformation was Florence, birthplace of Alessandro di Mariano Filippi, who arrived into this revolutionary world of artistic opportunity in 1445. So, who was he? Well, we know him better by his family nickname, Sandro Botticelli.
Botticelli received his nickname from his brother. It means little barrel.
It's actually quite a mean nickname. I mean, you can imagine this really horrid elder brother giving him this nickname.
Some people say it was because he was a bit tubby. Other people say because they all liked to have a drink at the time. But yeah, little barrel stuck. Botticelli loved art from a really early age. His father was a tanner, so very creative, working with his hands. And Botticelli loved anything that was visual, aesthetic.
He's not obviously a child prodigy when it comes to art, but eventually sort of focuses on painting.
So he went and did a training apprentice with a monk, Fra Filippo Lippi. He was a little bit crazy, but he was brilliant.
Fra Filippo Lippi was an eccentric friar. He'd been brought up by nuns and captured by pirates and was infamous for his sexual adventures. But despite all of that, he was one of Florence's biggest artistic talents.
He introduced Botticelli to the wonders of colour and narrative and symbolism in art, and Botticelli loved it.
The little barrel had found his calling. Under Lippi's tuition, he flourished into a skilled and diligent painter.
His detailed, stylised way of working, the way he made everything look very beautiful, were really admired, and it happened very quickly that he was sought after.
It didn't take long for Botticelli to set up on his own, and his choice of address would be key to his Birth of Venus, because among his close neighbours were a wealthy family called the Vespucci. Caterina Romai is a specialist in Renaissance Italy.
This is Via del Porcellana, where Botticelli got his workshop. All these ground floors of the houses that you see today were originally workshops. Still today, full of artisans. So it's one area of the city that didn't change much from the Renaissance to today. This is supposed to be the house of Botticelli where he worked. These explain very well the relation between the Vespucci and Botticelli, because the house is located exactly in the back of the Vespucci Palace. The working class live here, and they work for the wealthiest people living in the palaces on the two ends of Via del Porcellana. The workshop of Botticelli was full of life. It was a real shop. So the patrons, the wealthiest people, in this case the Vespucci, go to the workshop of Botticelli. They tell to him what they would like to have. We would like to have a Madonna painted with the baby Jesus. And the Vespucci are the first important clients who commission important objects to Botticelli.
In these early years, Botticelli created endless pious paintings of Mary the Madonna and other religious scenes. But although strictly Catholic in nature, his art couldn't help but be influenced by the world going past his window. Here in the National Gallery in London is one of his many Adoration of the Kings, painted when Botticelli was in his 20s.
For me, this is an almost perfect summation of what Florentine society was like during Botticelli's lifetime. It is first and foremost a Christian religious society, and there is the Virgin Mary with the Christ child at the absolute center of the painting. But in front of them, there is a great swirling crowd of absolutely up-to-the-minute, spiffy, modern, very fashionable Florentines. They're there in their extraordinary hats, bright red tights, the velvet hose, the doublets. It's a very, very fashionable, highly materialistic, modern society. But what is hanging over all of them? The arches and the pillars of the ancient world, classical, pagan Greece and Rome. This is a vibrant, materialistic, modern society, but always, always in the shadow of the pagans.
For Botticelli, it would be the meeting of these two worlds, his closest neighbours and the mythology of ancient Italy, that would prompt him to create the most important and daring work of his entire career, his astonishing Birth of Venus. Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus is among the most instantly recognisable masterpieces to come out of Renaissance Florence. This figure has become a universal visual shorthand for beauty, but there's more to Botticelli's goddess than meets the eye.
There is a face in Botticelli's art very, very similar to his Venus, which appears again and again. This is a very good example, his Venus and Mars of 1485, and here she is with her long hair and her absolutely unmistakable face. Who the devil was she? Well, remarkably, extraordinarily, we think we know. In Florence, she was an immigrant from faraway Genoa, and her name was Simonetta.
So how did beautiful Simonetta come into the life of Botticelli, the little barrel? Well, his whole life, Botticelli lived and worked within just a few streets in the Santa Maria Novella district of Florence, cheek by jowl with his neighbours, the Vespucci. And it was a son of the family, Marco, who brought the 15-year-old girl with the haunting face onto the streets of Renaissance Florence.
Marco married Simonetta Cataneo, who's from a very influential family in Genoa, and she comes to Florence in about 1468. It wasn't all that common for Florentine families to marry out of the city. She was something of a novelty, this person who nobody knew already turning up, and she evidently becomes this kind of famous beauty within the city.
She became a massive celebrity. Everyone wanted to see her, wanted to look at her. She was described as the most beautiful woman in Florence.
Their jaws dropped, their eyes popped out of their heads. It was almost, you know, cartoon-like. Why was she so appealing? She was so beautiful.
It was as if a teenage Marilyn Monroe had moved in next door to Andy Warhol. But though Botticelli would seize Simonetta's image for his most famous painting, it would take the intervention of an even more powerful family than the Vespucci to tie their fates together. A family so famous and so rich they're built into the very fabric of Florence. The Medici.
I would describe the Medici as the leading oligarchs of Florence. They're bankers to the popes, and they do so well in Florentine politics that they essentially become the rulers of the city.
The Medici ruled Florence for 60 years, from effectively 1434 until 1494. So we have something quite unique at this point. We have a family who were bankers. They're not princes, they're not warriors. They've not come to power through the force of arms.
Whatever you say about them, they definitely believed in Florence and Florence's greatness.
The only way to make it big in this great city was to grab the Medici's attention, attract that, and Botticelli would, like the florin itself, be minted. His chance came when he was commissioned to paint a nativity, or adoration of the baby Jesus, by another family equally keen to curry favour with the rulers of Florence.
Botticelli paints an adoration for the Del Lama family. And this is a really interesting commission. Now, it's quite common in this period that you put in little figures into these religious paintings to represent the donors. But Botticelli goes a lot further than that. The kings who are bringing gold and frankincense and myrrh are actually figures from the Medici family. It isn't directly a Medici commission. Clearly, however, somebody wants to sort of suck up to the leading oligarchs of Florence.
The somebodies who are buttering up the Medici are also in the composition, both looking directly out at the viewer. Gaspare del Lama is pointing at himself as if in answer to the question, who paid for this? And below him, standing proud, is Botticelli. This self-portrait is one of the only pictures of Botticelli we have today. But his smart, calculated depiction of the Medici as the three wise men certainly got him noticed. And just as he'd gained their attention, so had his beautiful young neighbour, the woman who'd inspire his Birth of Venus, Simonetta Vespucci.
A couple of the Medici boys were in love with Simonetta, and they used to have jousting competitions and tournaments every few years. And Botticelli painted her portrait for the banner of one of the Medici boys who won the competition. And when he won it, he said, I won it not just for me, but I won it for the beauty of Simonetta.
Simonetta was just as inspiring for Botticelli. She had become his ideal muse, the perfection of human beauty. But if this was an artistic match made in heaven, it wasn't one for this earth. Great beauty doesn't last long, certainly not on the disease-ridden streets of 15th century Florence. A year after the joust, aged 23, Simonetta died of tuberculosis. Her funeral procession drew massive crowds yearning for a glimpse of their Simonetta. She was displayed in an open casket.
Thousands of people followed her coffin. People mourned her, I suppose as we do for a great celebrity. People felt they knew her, felt they loved her because of her beauty.
Because she actually doesn't live out her years. I think perhaps along the same lines as you might think about for Marilyn Monroe or Princess Diana. The famous beauty reputation is then enhanced and she becomes a kind of idealised beauty.
Simonetta had melted hearts all over Florence. Now Botticelli determinedly kept her memory alive by painting her again and again. Taking his behaviour at face value, Sandro, like his clients, seems to have been completely obsessed.
Botticelli very rarely strayed from her image. If he's going to paint females, either Venus or the Virgin Mary, he wanted to paint the most beautiful woman he possibly could imagine, and to him, she was that.
Botticelli painted Simonetta time and time again because she was so popular. The men that couldn't have her physically could have a likeness of her. She was beauty and perfection. She was the pin-up.
And it was a strategy that worked. With the beauty of his rich compositions and the skill of his portraiture, Botticelli was now highly in demand. He was even asked by the Pope to paint frescoes in the Sistine Chapel. But his rich Florentine patrons were getting bored of religious work after religious work. So for his next commission, Botticelli created something very different. It's called Primavera, or Spring, and this 1480 masterpiece is a remarkable rehearsal for the birth of Venus. Brimming with juicy exuberance, it shows Venus, goddess of love, celebrating the arrival of spring in a flowery forest. And if she looks familiar, it is, of course, because she is almost certainly Simonetta.
This does seem to be Botticelli being very original. It is a large secular painting of ancient mythological figures, and that is very new.
Primavera was a radical departure for Italian art. It's one of the first paintings in the Western world made solely for pleasure, where there is no moral tale, no deep religious message. It's only to be enjoyed.
I mean, this is a very expensive commission as well in terms of the materials that are being used. There is gold in there, there is azurite, and there's also a phenomenal attention to detail. I think there are about 130 specified types of flower scattered across that garden in the Primavera, which is quite extraordinary.
Who commissioned it has been much debated, but what we do know is that this decadent mythical scene was eventually displayed in the bedroom of Lorenzo de' Medici. The artist who would soon embark on his iconic Birth of Venus was now clearly marked out as a painter willing to take risks.
Primavera opened up Botticelli to a whole world of mythological subjects. And here in Venus and Mars, painted just afterwards, he's at it again. This is a languorous, lush, and absolutely non-Christian subject.
Based on another well-known myth, here Venus reclines on a cushion, whilst Mars, the god of war, sleeps so deeply he appears to be snoring.
Venus and Mars may be the most convincing post-coital image ever made, but it also demonstrates so much of how Botticelli made his art and why he's so famous today.
Painted around the same time, all the techniques Botticelli would bring to the Birth of Venus are also evident here.
First of all, that extraordinary drawing. I mean, he is the great drawer of all the greatest painters. He has a line which is absolutely accurate, entirely beautiful, but as sharp as if it was done with a scalpel. It's extraordinary. He has great, rich colour, fantastic attention to detail. That grass would prick your feet, and it's full of great wit. He's a very funny man and a very funny painter when he wants to be. With these works, we're not in the real world, we're in a kind of magical, idealized forest. Botticelli is pushing Renaissance ideas about beauty and love to a new place.
And he wasn't done pushing yet, because while Primavera and Venus and Mars were surprising, with the Birth of Venus, Botticelli was about to create something downright scandalous. The Birth of Venus is one of the most recognizable paintings in the world. Starring Florentine beauty Simonetta Vespucci, these days it's seen as a pretty conventional masterpiece of Renaissance art. But when it was painted by Sandro Botticelli in the late 15th century, it was completely revolutionary.
The painting was a truly radical commission, life-size nude, on a canvas, and also not of a Christian woman.
A painting like The Birth of Venus was seen as taking a great liberty and, oh my goodness, what is this artist doing?
Botticelli had already defied the norm with his pagan paintings Primavera and Venus and Mars. So why was The Birth of Venus seen as quite so bonkers? Well, simply because no one had painted a nude like this before, one that asked that most fundamental of questions: what is art for? To praise God or to give mankind enjoyment?
Botticelli was one of the most sought-after artists in northern Italy. His sinuous drawing and the grace of his brushwork meant that even in a picture-saturated, image-drenched world, his paintings were fresh and surprising. But even for Botticelli, The Birth of Venus was one heck of a gamble.
And the reason for that is entirely about what was acceptable in the Catholic world in which Botticelli lived.
I think it's important to distinguish between the nude, which is something that happens in art, and merely naked bodies. Because in terms of naked bodies, they are found all across Italian painting well before Botticelli. But mostly they are there for a very different purpose. They're there to remind us all of the unhappy and undignified truth of our lives.
Almost all works of art from the years before Botticelli painted The Birth of Venus had a moral or Christian theme, especially those including naked figures.
And so here, for instance, all the naked people are in hell, squirming, writhing. Even in Masaccio's very, very famous painting of Adam and Eve being expelled, Adam, well, his genitals are on full display. He's not hiding himself there. He's hiding his face to show his shame. Eve is covering herself. Her face is just a rictus of despair and horror. Nothing in any way titillating about it. They're there basically to say we are clothed in flesh, all of us, and we are rotting, which you may agree is not a profoundly erotic thought.
And yet, The Birth of Venus is a painting clearly all about stirring up erotic thoughts and feelings. And so to do that, Botticelli had to use every technique he'd acquired. By mixing alabaster powder into his paint, he added a shimmering quality to his brushwork. The highlights are emphasized with gold leaf, details that must have seemed almost luminescent in the Florentine sunshine. But it's the attention he pays to his central figure which is most arresting.
He painted her in a stance that was taken from the ancient Greeks. She's standing in what's known as the Venus pudica stance, where she's covering up all her private areas. Her hair is covering her modesty.
She's beautiful, but is she? She's got very long legs that if she tried to walk away from the painting, she actually wouldn't be able to stand up. And her arms are extra, extra long. And she has no shoulders, they're sloping. And they go right up from the arms to the neck. And the reason being is because necks were considered a very attractive spot on a female, an area to be seduced and planted with little kisses. And that's why her neck goes all the way down her arms to her long legs.
In this painting, Botticelli created an image unlike anything seen before by Florentine society. And yet, unlike his Adoration of the Magi or the work in Rome's Sistine Chapel, this was a painting that was not supposed to be seen by the public. It was private art, strictly for behind closed doors.
The fact that it was designed to be seen only by a few might explain why Botticelli felt he could get away with this. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Fine. But a shamelessly nude woman on a clamshell, and yes, there is a metaphor there, blowing in from the sea? Sandro, really? Would it be too much for his clients to stomach? Well, it's known to have been kept quietly in a Medici palace.
Birth of Venus would have gone into a private chamber in this Villa di Castello outside of Florence. Wouldn't have been seen by many people.
It was probably commissioned for a wedding, and it was probably to hang behind the bed, the marital bed.
Probably hidden behind velvet curtains, a sort of foreplay, if you like, a bit of a tease, a sexual tease.
But even though it was kept out of the way of prying eyes, Botticelli's radical Birth of Venus still had an impact far beyond the bedroom where it was hanging.
The Medici's friends, as we know, were in a great circle of very influential people, and also other artists would have known about it, talked about it, seen it in Botticelli's studio. From then on, artists began to paint nudes more readily.
Botticelli's Birth of Venus had a huge impact on other artists. It opened the floodgates for other artists to realise that they didn't have to just paint religious narrative. And at the time, artists like Titian and Giorgione would have thought, yes, let's paint the nude.
Now in middle age, the artistic revolutionary Sandro Botticelli had the world at his feet. But a very different revolution was about to break out in Florence. For years, the city had been a playground for the ultra-rich, obsessed with splashing the cash on showy materialistic luxuries. But as the decadence of their lifestyles reached a fever pitch of extravagance, Florence became a powder keg of class resentment. Enter Girolamo, the mad monk, Savonarola, who arrived to light its fuse with a verbal flamethrower.
Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara, north of Florence. He was a mesmeric preacher. He was really a fire-breathing fundamentalist who was preaching for a reform of the church.
He is quite concerned for the moral welfare of the city, and he has a lot to say about that.
The church was corrupt, the political institutions of Florence were corrupt, and he wanted both of them to be reformed.
He disapproves of gambling, he disapproves of card playing, he disapproves of sodomy, he disapproves of all sorts of, women wearing too much makeup, certainly sex outside marriage, all these bad things that Florence is doing which can only get the city into trouble.
Savonarola was not opposed to all art. He believed art had a purpose within Christianity, but he believed that art was devotional. What he did not want to have on the walls of churches were images of the Virgin Mary in which she looked, as he said, like a harlot.
He doesn't like all this pagan art, as he calls it, the art that draws on classical myths, whether that is poetry or whether it's visual art.
The preacher's hellfire sermons cast a spell over everyone who listened to them.
We do know that Botticelli seems to have stepped back from a lot of his artwork under Savonarola and to have been something of a supporter.
Botticelli was mesmerized by him and completely believed his message about reform and about the decadence of art.
And no painting would have looked more decadent than his own Birth of Venus. Maria Antonia Rinaldi is a Florentine expert in the years of Savonarola's domination.
This square, at the time of Savonarola and Botticelli, around 1497, 1498, was the witness, we can say, of quite incredible events. The preaching of Savonarola became more effective over the people of Florence. Objects that he considered sinful were banished from the town. Playing cards, tarots, dices, mythological paintings. Savonarola created this kind of little army of young kids who were dressed in white and with the red cross, and who were little spies around the town who were telling him if someone still keeping objects that were considered sinful.
On the morning of February the 7th, this rabid zealotry reached fever pitch, and Savonarola's miniature army of child soldiers ransacked the city of all those objects he deemed wicked.
And here there was a huge pyre, around 15 meters for 20 meters. There was on the top the representation of the devil. And all these objects, chairs, perfumes, fabric, books, and a painting with mythological imagery would be burnt. This entire fire was called the bonfire of vanity. Botticelli himself brought the bonfire of vanities some of his painting to be burned.
I think we can probably safely assume that given his admiration for Savonarola, he would, had he still had the Birth of Venus in his studio or in his house, taken that giant, beautiful work of art and put it on the bonfire and watched it burn.
The master of the beautiful nude was hypnotized. He would never paint another secular image like his Birth of Venus again. And that remained true even when Savonarola's reign of terror proved to be short-lived.
It's a little bit too much for people within Florence who get a bit sick of sort of religious austerity. It gets a little bit too much for the Pope, who thinks that Savonarola has gone too far and is a heretic. And in 1498, it all comes to a head, and Savonarola is arrested, charged with heresy, forced to confess, and is burnt at the stake.
And exactly here we have the plaque commemorating the spot where in 1498 Girolamo Savonarola was hanged and burnt, a little bit more than 1 year after his bonfire of vanity.
The execution of his guru destroyed Botticelli, who had lost commissions and his income because of his born-again religious fervour. His world slowly caved in on itself.
He goes back to working in what often seems rather old-fashioned style, and he's quite rapidly eclipsed by artists working in a new style. People like Raphael, like Leonardo da Vinci, and a little bit later on, Michelangelo.
The last decade of Botticelli's life simply ebbed away.
He'd been surrounded by the whole of the Medici court. He'd been feted as the greatest artist. But by the time he died, he was crippled, he was poor, he lost popularity. It was a complete fall from grace. He died a lonely, poor man.
Botticelli's death was a sad end for the man who'd been one of the brightest stars of the early Renaissance. For the next 300 years, though Botticelli's name was never entirely forgotten, his reputation faded and his canvases gathered dust in neglected corners. He suffered that special purgatory for artists, to be remembered by the academics and almost nobody else. It would take a radical artistic movement in England and a painting hanging here in the National Gallery in London to restore his place in the pantheon of the greatest painters and allow his Venus to be reborn for the world to enjoy.
After Botticelli died a forgotten pauper in 1510, his astonishing, magical Birth of Venus was quickly forgotten, seemingly lost to the world forever.
That is, until the middle of the 19th century, when a British collector, William Fuller Maitland, splashed out all of £80 on another Botticelli canvas, the beautiful Mystic Nativity.
William Fuller Maitland was delighted with his purchase. He liked it so much that in 1857 he decided to loan it to the Art Treasures exhibition in Manchester. Over the next 140 days, more than 1.3 million visitors saw Botticelli's painting, and it set the mid-Victorian art world aflame.
The Mystic Nativity gave the Victorians something that had been missing from British art, frankly, for centuries: an emotional directness, a lightness of touch, even a kind of wit. This is a painting about the apocalypse and the end of time, and yet also playful. There's Mary looking absolutely exhausted, strung out like a real mother as she prays over the Christ child, who is rather tubby and very, very squirmy. There's something lovable even about the 7 devils squirming off to hell. It's human and direct and simple and fresh.
And the British public couldn't get enough of it.
All of a sudden, it was almost like Botticelli mania. People would just sort of fall over themselves to go and see this painting.
Among those caught up in the excitement were a group of young British painters and poets. Botticelli and Simonetta were reborn in the work of John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
Artists that became known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were fascinated by the way he worked. Botticelli became their favourite artist because of the delicate way he painted, because of the jewel-bright works that he produced.
They were so in awe of him that he was their main inspiration. He was showing beauty, he was showing love, he was showing the aesthetics of picture-making.
But the way the Mystic Nativity showcases Botticelli's skill and importance in the story of British painting isn't the only reason this canvas matters so much. It also led directly to revived interest in the birth of Venus. It led to the rebirth of the birth of Venus.
Lit by a ferocious passion for the Renaissance master, Botticelli's new admirers flocked to Florence. And as they entered the Uffizi, they came face to face with the most astonishing of all his works. Here was the birth of Venus. Rescued from the depths of a Medici palace in the early 19th century, for years this canvas had been almost ignored by the gallery's visitors. Now its popularity skyrocketed. Within just a couple of years, she was the most popular exhibit, a position she still holds today. And just around the corner, Botticelli's final resting place is still visited by hundreds of his smitten worshippers. Maya Gattan is a Botticelli specialist.
We're standing in front of the Church of the Ognissanti in Florence. This was Botticelli's parish church. His house was just really around the corner. He spent just about all of his working life near this church. And he is also buried in this church. And people come to Botticelli's tomb to pay their respects as a kind of pilgrimage. The spot that he's buried is right over here behind this wall. And Simonetta Vespucci was buried also in this church, very nearby Botticelli's grave, because her family, the Vespucci, were parishioners, and their family tombs were here as well. Due to some poetry that was written at the time of her death, Botticelli was thought to have wanted to have been buried next to Simonetta Vespucci.
Which begs the question, just how did Botticelli feel about Simonetta? Was he really in love with her?
What we know about Botticelli in terms of sexuality is that he never marries. When he's asked about marrying, he seems quite horrified by the idea, and he's allegedly keeping a boy. My sort of suspicion is that his interests actually lie elsewhere. If you look at culture today, there are a lot of gay artists who paint female models and who have a kind of female muse, and it's not necessarily a kind of sexualized in love with relationship. So, I mean, we could think of it, you know, in those terms, like she's a kind of Judy Garland, you know?
Whatever the truth was, and we'll never know for sure, it all adds to the mystery, only serving to increase our fascination with Botticelli and his muse, Simonetta.
It's really a beautiful gesture that when his image was resurrected in the 19th century, eventually it was decided to put a marker here that people were coming to his tomb and leaving notes for him. There are a lot of notes for him. Dear Sandro, send a little bit of inspiration to the poor Russian artist. Sandro, you deserve much more. Your art is amazing. I hope you're happy being with Simonetta Vespucci. Suggests that the myth is still very much alive, that he was inspired by her. These notes show that people are still inspired and still reading into his paintings. I mean, the Birth of Venus is about the birth of beauty. I mean, that's the way that Venus was understood in the 15th century, about the birth of beauty and about the birth of love. I mean, it's a universal theme. And so, of course, today we're still interested in it.
The Birth of Venus is so popular now. I've even got a little tray with the Birth of Venus on it. Tea towels, biscuit tins, jigsaw puzzles.
If I can say something personal, I first went to Florence when I was a teenager with my mum, and I couldn't sleep the night before I knew I was going to see it. I was so excited. So it does cause an almost disproportional reaction in a lot of people, and it doesn't disappoint. It's an iconic work, and it stands the test of time.
With the Birth of Venus, Botticelli laid the foundations for a modern perception of beauty and fundamentally changed the way Western art considered the female nude. His is a majestic, overpowering vision of the female triumphant. She is a goddess. Show respect.
These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe,
there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power.
Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, Paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story.
I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world? Ever since London's National Gallery opened its doors nearly 2 centuries ago, people have flocked through them for a glimpse of its exceptional collection.
In the early days, there were only 38 pictures to look at here, as against well over 2,000 now. Every single important Western art movement is represented here, running from the early Middle Ages right the way through to the early 20th century. Here you will find extraordinary achievements which have changed the course of art history in room after room after room.
Behind every piece here,
there is a story, but there is one painting, and you will know it, whose impact on the story of Western art is perhaps particularly surprising. I'm talking about John Constable's The Haywain. This is, in essence, a very, very simple image of the little pinch of England that Constable knew best. It's the Suffolk-Essex border, the River Stour, and in the middle there is a haywain, a cart which has just delivered its load of hay over here to Flatford Mill, the Constable family business. That's Willie Lott's cottage on the left, a building Constable knew very well and drew and sketched obsessively all his life. In the far distance, you can not only see the harvesters scything and working away, little blobs in the distance, working very hard. You can, if you look really carefully, see a second haywain, in this case, absolutely laden with hay, and the little boy sitting on top of it. It's almost completely disguised by the trees, but it's there.
For such a gentle scene, it's extraordinary how it's imprinted itself on the national psyche.
Everything is lapping and moving in a kind of gorgeous, midsummer, golden haze. I think the overarching feeling of this painting is calm and peace. There is a natural order, and all is well with this world.
This is most people's ideal of what the serene English countryside should look like. But behind the canvas, there is an unexpected story.
It is a story of rebellion, above all, a story of painting and working against the odds, of believing in yourself when nobody else will, and believing also that even in the most remote corners of the countryside, you can do new things so radical and extraordinary, they will spark revolutions a very long way from home.
If you want to understand the world of this masterpiece and the man who created it, you have to begin in his beloved Suffolk, the landscape that fed his imagination for his entire life. John Constable was born in this village on the 11th of June, 1776.
He is one of 6 children who are the product of a very happy and steady marriage between his parents, Anne and Golding Constable.
Golding Constable is often described as a miller, but that's actually doesn't quite give the right impression of his status. He was more of a rural entrepreneur.
Wanting for nothing, Constable described his comfortable early life as a careless childhood. For Simon Peachy from the National Trust, there are clues across East Berkhold which reveal the kind of upbringing the young Constable enjoyed.
Constable family home was just on the other side of these railings, but the railings are the only part of the house that exists today. In his time, it was a big mansion, one of the biggest houses in East Bergholt. He painted some famous pictures of the kitchen garden and the flower garden. And you can imagine, it's standing here, what the house and the grounds would have looked like.
Constable had a very privileged life. His father was rich. He came from this wonderfully comfortable background, and he loved the countryside. He was always out sketching the countryside.
He was absolutely adamant that he wanted to be a painter, although nobody in his family, or even remotely connected with his family, had ever been an artist.
Constable was inspired by Suffolk's vast, overarching skies, thickly wooded glades and busy rivers, but he didn't know how to channel his passion until a chance encounter.
When he was 19, he met a travelling connoisseur, George Beaumont, who was an amateur painter and always travelled with one of his paintings by the 17th century French painter Claude, and he showed it to Constable, and that was the first masterpiece he would have seen.
This was the first time he saw a painting that began to match how he felt about landscape, that gave him the same kind of thrill he felt sketching. The path to the Haywain, however, would not be easy. The first blot on the landscape was in the shape of his formidable father.
Golding, having made a substantial fortune and set up a very sound business, wanted John to take over the business. And there was a big tussle with his father about that.
With great unhappiness, he knuckled under. The only advantage was that running mills meant he became a skilled observer of the weather, a professional eye essential for his art. His determination to be a painter didn't wane, and after 5 long years, he finally got his way.
It wasn't until quite late on, 1799, when he was well into his 20s, that he got permission to go to London and start training as an artist.
Now 23, he headed for the chaotic hubbub of the capital to study at the Royal Academy. He was given a basic income of £100 to pay for board and lodgings by his reluctant father. That's only £8,000 in today's money. This meagre allowance meant that Constable was doubly desperate for success as an artist, and to achieve that, he first needed to get his landscapes into the great summer exhibition.
If you want to be an artist, you have to make it at the Academy. This is a very real competition for money, for patronage, and above all, for reputation. And if you are exhibited in the Academy in what's known as the Great Room, where you will be seen by the great and the good, you know you've made it.
But the great and the good barely got a chance to see Constable's paintings, because even the few that were accepted were seen as drearily unfashionable.
Constable has set himself a very difficult furrow to plough. At the time, history painting is considered to be the most prestigious. Instead, he's chosen to specialise in landscape, which is seen to be a much more inferior genre. And within landscape itself, he is also not choosing to do grand historical landscapes. Instead, he's chosen a type of scenery which actually would be considered by most people to be very bland, very workaday, boring, unexceptional sorts of places.
Considering he was quite a mild-mannered man, one would think that he might have thought, well, I'll have a go at what everybody else likes. But no, he insisted he wanted to paint in this way. He was fascinated by painting nature as he saw it.
But it wasn't just the subjects that failed to arrest visitors' attention. His relatively small canvases were lost against the vast classical landscapes by other exhibitors, like the hugely successful J.M.W. Turner.
I think effectively nobody much noticed them. They were hung not just side by side on the wall, up 3, 4, 5 high, and in order to pick up attention, somehow it had to have some sort of real star quality, and Constable couldn't manage to muster that.
Constable was surrounded by the painting superstars of the age, doing those huge historical canvases and glossy, fashionable portraits, exactly what the Royal Academy and its patrons really wanted.
And at the same time, Constable was painting exactly what he really wanted, which was stunningly, amazingly unpopular.
Unsuccessful, unappreciated and poor, the future wasn't looking bright for John Constable. But perseverance is all. He wasn't so far away from a masterpiece that would propel him to international fame. He realised that to get noticed, bigger would be better. Next up would be his famous 6-footers. It's hard to think of a painting more English than the Haywain, a scene indelibly linked to the national psyche. And yet, for most of his life, its creator, John Constable, was far from a success. For an artist now seen as so very conservative, he was remarkably experimental, which didn't help sales.
Now, it's not that he didn't want to earn money. Early on, he took church commissions, and all his life he painted portraits to keep the cash rolling in. But what really turned Constable on was the magic of the English countryside in all its seasons, the softness, the fertile freshness, and above all, those subtle, glowing colours.
He was happiest when painting his placid scenes, but doing so in a radically new way. He valued what he saw in the raw, with his own eyes, nature unfiltered. He could only do this by working outdoors, which was both unconventional and irritatingly difficult.
He believed you couldn't paint nature unless you looked at it. So he wasn't painting every leaf, but he was painting what to us looks extremely realistic, extremely naturalistic. And this was so radical for the time.
At that point, most people painted in studios. And Constable was seen sometimes as a little bit mad for wanting to paint outdoors. It was a difficult process. Now you can buy little portable paint pots and little tubes of paint. Then he had to take his paints, most of which he would have made himself, in a kind of pig's bladder or some kind of animal skin pouch that would not let the paint go dry. It was a really big performance, and that's why most people didn't do it. Constable was seen as very unusual.
Despite the innovation and the obsessive effort, all of which would eventually feed into his Haywain, these paintings failed to find buyers. So when the struggling artist fell in love and married Maria, a childhood friend from a well-to-do family, the daughter of King George IV's solicitor, life suddenly became a lot more complicated.
The romance of John Constable and Maria Bicknell is a Jane Austen story with lots of complications, opposition from the family, dramas, unexpected meetings, all that sort of thing.
Neither family thought they should marry. Her family didn't like him because they thought he'd never be rich enough as an artist to support her.
Constable still had a small share of the family business, but this didn't bring in much. So, to try to provide for his new wife and young family, he now needed to make his painting finally pay its way.
It was not an easy journey for Constable. He struggled financially and emotionally all through his artistic career.
And yet there was this drive in him to produce these naturalistic paintings, to carry on painting the skies in such detail and to paint the water. Even though he felt that he was a failure, he carried on, hoping that other people would see what he could see.
The single-minded Constable would not compromise on the unpopular style or narrow subject of his paintings.
He was extremely strong-minded, absolutely determined about what he wanted to do. And actually, one of the things about Constable is that he gets most of his major pictures for years and years from a few hundred yards of the river, which he knew intimately well.
Then, in 1819, he widened his gaze and inspiration struck. Since his smaller canvases were lost on walls full of epic paintings, why not think a lot bigger?
One of the things he does is to come up with a completely new kind of exhibition landscape, which he calls the 6-footer, where he explodes his river stour scenes that he's so keen to reveal the everyday poetry and beauty of, up to a monumental scale that would be more readily associated with epic history painting.
The first of these 6-footers is called The White Horse, which he unveiled to the Royal Academy later that year.
crucially, it sold. And finally, he felt that he was starting to get somewhere. These large-scale paintings really started to give him hope that he was going to make it as a landscape artist.
For the first time, people really begin to sit up and take notice of him. I think the pictures are simply too big not to be noticed.
Unsurprisingly, Constable planned to go big again with his next canvas, one he'd been thinking about and prepping for years, and the painting that would finally establish his place in history.
The Haywain evokes a Suffolk scene that Constable grew up with, and we know he knew very well indeed. But it was painted here in London, more than 70 miles southwest of the original subject. So, obvious question, how did Constable get that juicy freshness from so very, very far away? Leafing through earlier images of Constable's work, it becomes increasingly obvious that the Haywain is not one single moment in time, but the culmination of years and years of looking and painting and drawing. So, for example, here from 11 years before the Haywain is another painting of Flatford Lock. Lovely, fresh, lush and beautiful, and of the buildings around Flatford Lock. Again, 10 years beforehand, he's already noting down the details of the buildings. And the Haywain itself, well, there are lots of drawings of horses and carts and wains, I suppose you'd call them. Here's a rather crude one where he's clearly working very fast from life. You can see that by the nervousness of the pencil lines, if you like. Lots and lots of redrawing around the figure and so forth. That could only be from life, but very beautiful. And here, for instance, is a more completed drawing, again of a cart and two horses in this case, and he's fascinated by the way the shadows fall around the wheel, the rim of the wheel, the spokes, everything is in great detail. This is a man who is always watching, always noting, and crucially, always remembering.
It would take him 2 years to complete after Constable started preparing the Haywain at his London studio in 1819. Maria, however, was struggling with her health, and so a change of scenery and cleaner air were essential in the summer months.
London, which was a city of 1 million people with medieval sanitation and primitive infrastructure, heated entirely by coal, was so polluted that you could see a sort of dome-shaped grey cloud hanging over it from 15, 20 miles away.
Constable moved his family north to just beside Hampstead Heath to avoid the smog. It may seem surprising to find the home of a man so associated with rural life here, but this part of London, the country in the town, would matter in his struggle to create the Haywain. The current owner of his last address in Hampstead is Christine Pullen.
Constable loved the house, but he complained to his friend John Fisher that living here was ruining him because he was paying 4 guineas a week for the house furnished at a time when an artisan family could be housed and fed on £1 a week. So that was an enormous sum, and he had a growing family, and he was not selling many pictures at that time.
But there was one definite advantage in paying those bills.
This is the backyard of the house, where Constable found a shed containing mops and brooms and buckets and coals, and he cleared the shed out in order to create a small workroom where he could work on his sketches. Here, he was in the middle of the countryside, effectively, then, and he liked the open views of the skies and made a lot of sketches while he was living at 2 Lower Terrace. He called it skying.
On the heath, he would spend days with his eyes glued to the skies and clouds, a delighted weatherman. Only 4 years before Constable began making his annual excursions to Hampstead, the first ever book of cloud classifications had been published. This was a text he's thought to have read, as he believed that we see nothing until we truly understand it, and the details of the skies he sketched here would eventually find their way into the Suffolk of the Haywain.
Constable was fascinated by the passing clouds and the changing of the light. It's very similar to the skies in East Anglia, and I think that's one of the aspects of Hampstead that attracted him to the area.
While Constable was lost in his obsession perfecting the skies for the Haywain, for perhaps the first time there was a good reason for him not to be in Suffolk. The Industrial Revolution was sweeping across Britain. Infrastructure and agriculture were changing fast. The rivers and the mills were now part of a capitalist economy, ripping up the old ways and plunging many rural workers into uncertainty and hunger.
The agricultural labourers were leaving their work to go and work in the cities, and then those who were staying to work were finding that agriculture started to become much more mechanised. It was a time of huge inequality, a lot of poverty, and a lot of people who were really eking out a subsistence either from the land or from a very poorly paid job.
Less than 4 years before Constable began his Haywain, a sharp hike in the cost of bread led to riots across East Anglia.
The poor labourers couldn't afford bread. They weren't earning enough to even pay for bread. The only thing they could do to try and draw attention to themselves and to their families that were starving was to riot and protest.
Torched by despairing workers, much of Constable's home patch was now surrounded by the glare of fires. And as he began work on the Haywain, how much of this rebellion would be reflected in it? Absolutely none. This is the art of a Tory idealist, not a social realist.
And this, I think, is what's particularly striking about Constable's painting. It is political art. Not directly, he's certainly not shouting or stabbing a finger at us, but he is saying that this vision of natural harmony and social peace, not what you're reading in the newspapers about turmoil and strikes and protests, but this is how it ought to be. In terms of his technique, the way he put paint on the canvas, Constable was an avant-garde, progressive painter. But in terms of his message, what he was trying to say, he was profoundly conservative.
By 1821, preparations for the final canvas were coming together.
Now, what I find really exciting is the way that you can follow the progression of the work by sketches and images as it develops. So right at the beginning, you have a very, very loose, very impressionistic picture. This could have been done by Monet or any of the Impressionists in the 1870s, it seems to me. It's very, very loose, very fresh, and I love it. Lots of people love the sketches particularly. And then later on, there's a more worked-up version, which is very clearly the same painting, exactly the same design. The colours are slightly more muted and the paintwork is looser, but he's clearly got in focus exactly what he's going to paint. And then you get the final version. Suddenly the colours bounce out and it's fresh and complete, the final and perfect 6-footer. It was the hauling together of all of these images, the triumphant compilation of a body of work Constable had been at since childhood, which makes this 6-footer such an extraordinary moment. The Haywain isn't just a picture, it is the combination of 40 years of looking and working. It is everything that Constable knew on a single page.
He was ready to give the world his masterpiece, but was the world ready to receive it? The Haywain, the most famous work by the 19th century artist John Constable, is widely regarded as the quintessential English landscape painting. Completed in 1821, the scene looks calm, serene, and effortless, though the process of creating it was anything but.
Constable was one of the great painters of British weather. Now, lots and lots of people, of course, had painted skies and clouds and wood throughout art history, but in almost all cases, they weren't really painted or drawn by people who had sat outside in the real weather, the English weather, as Constable had for months and months and months and got flies all over him and got soaked by the rain. He'd studied the clouds obsessively for years, month in, month out, and these are real clouds. They're moving at speed. You can tell they're moving fast. The wind is up. And there's a real sense of wateriness about this picture. Not just the river splashing away and moving quite fast, the little boy fishing in it there and some ducks rising from the river, but also the sense of the cycle of water.
Constable once wrote about the sound of water escaping from mill dams, willows, old rotten planks, slimy posts and brickwork. I love such things. As long as I do paint, I shall never cease to paint such places. These have always been my delight.
You can tell it's rained relatively recently, that the mud is still wet, but there is more rain to come. You can see there's a heavy cloud there. There's going to be another shower. Not a drenching downpour, but just enough to produce that delicate freshness, the juiciness in the English landscape that Constable always thought should be there.
He submitted it to the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition of 1821. His last painting there, The White Horse, had been warmly received, and he hoped this would be even more so. As his fellow artists crowded into the Academy's rooms, he must have wondered if this would be the painting that proved he had been right all along.
When the Haywain was hung in the Royal Academy, people didn't like it. They didn't want it.
People were shocked. They were quite horrified that he would be so bold as to paint just a landscape that size. He was just sneered at.
This is a farm wagon he's painting. There aren't any mountains, there aren't any waterfalls, there aren't any wild rocks. It's just a pool in a rather ordinary little river in East Anglia.
One of the things they find problematic is what they call Constable's snow or piebald scumbling, the little dashes and brushstrokes of white pigment, which he liberally adds as the final layer of finish to a picture to capture what he describes as the elusive quality of sparkle in nature. But during the 19th century, people could not read those dabs of paint as anything other than dabs of paint. They couldn't see them for the visual metaphor they were meant to be, only as a very sort of troubling interruption on the surface of the picture. But I think his biggest problem is simply a lack of interest in what he's doing.
This was nearly a dreary disaster for Constable, except that there was one crucial visitor who could see its genius clearly.
One of the people to see the Haywain when it's exhibited at the Royal Academy in London is a French visitor to the capital, Théodore Géricault, who is being feted all over town for his incredible masterpiece, The Raft of the Medusa, an icon of French Romantic painting.
It's been said that Géricault's opinion of the Haywain changed the history of art forever.
He describes himself as quite stunned by it.
And rather than dismiss it as a strange work of art, as most of the British viewers had, he was amazed by it. He was spellbound. He saw something in it that the British hadn't seen.
So now an art dealer in Paris picked up on Géricault's excitement, and he suggested Constable send his painting to France to be exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1824. This was an unexpected thing to happen, but it was a real coup for John Constable.
The Parisian Salon at the Louvre is the art event of the Western world. If you were to use a sporting metaphor, then you could describe the Royal Academy as being like the Athletics World Championship, but the Salon is like the Olympics. It's the gold standard, and if you've made it there, you really have made it.
The Haywain was now going to be seen by the most important and influential French artists. But would a painting the very epitome of Englishness find favour with the French when it had failed so dismally at home?
When Constable's The Haywain was exhibited in the Paris Salon, that's when people's eyes opened and they wept in front of it because they realised what an astonishing painting it really was.
The French adored Constable instantly, a coup de foudre. Later, a curator at the Louvre would go on to call him the Messiah of landscape painting.
French artists cannot believe the originality and the freshness of Constable's approach. They're also drawn to the fact that Constable is painting his own native landscape. This is not a site drawn from classical antiquity. It is clearly somewhere very specific in England. One of the artists who sees it is Eugène Delacroix, who immediately goes to his own painting, The Massacre at Chios, a painting about a terrible slaughter of Greek inhabitants during the Greek War of Independence, and immediately starts to repaint areas of it based upon the handling that he sees in Constable's picture.
Constable's use of colour delighted Delacroix. He wrote, "What he says here about the green of his meadows can be applied to every tone." And the change of fortunes didn't end there for Constable and this revolutionary painting.
The work of this previously obscure British artist started to have a huge impact on French art as a whole.
From Delacroix, we go very quickly on to artists in his circle who begin to paint landscapes of the French countryside a la Constable, with sort of Haywain-esque tumble-down cottages beside a pond.
Constable's impact was seismic. His devotion to capturing a moment in nature through immersing himself in the outdoors inspired Paris. Here, in Constable's skies and sweet rural fields, was the groundwork for Impressionism. Meanwhile, radicals like Rousseau, Millais and Manet would soon be seeking out Constable's canvases for themselves. Constable's Haywain didn't just overturn the French art scene, it also transformed his own fortunes. Constable now sold more paintings in France than he'd managed during his entire career in Britain. That meant enough French francs rolling in to save Constable's bacon. But there is something quite extraordinary about this, is there not? There is John Constable, the ultimate patriotic, conservative image maker of rural England, and it's Paris that saves him. Thank God for the French. Great art is always rooted somewhere, but it is never limited by flags and national borders. But fame and fortune across the Channel was of little interest to Constable. He said, "I would rather be a poor man in England than a rich man abroad." And so when he was invited to France to be awarded a royal honour by the king himself, his response shouldn't have been a surprise.
He was given a gold medal which would have been presented by Charles X, but Constable fatally refused to travel to Paris to receive it in person. In fact, never left Britain. The furthest he ever went was the Lake District, and that was on the sort of outside edge of what Constable regarded as possible.
Despite this profound distaste for travel, Constable's prospects were definitely improving. But just 4 years after being celebrated as England's most innovative painter at the Paris Salon, disaster struck. His beloved wife, Maria, fell gravely ill.
She probably had tuberculosis and had always been delicate, but also her fate, as was the fate of an awful lot of middle-class Regency wives, was almost incessant pregnancy. She had 7 children and 2 miscarriages in about a decade, and that obviously had a seriously bad effect on her health.
Maria died shortly after the birth of her 7th child, and Constable was totally devastated. The face of the world had changed for him, he wrote in a letter to his brother. He wore mourning for the rest of his life, and he never really got over her demise.
Constable was overwhelmed by melancholy. His first major and much dreamed of triumph as an artist was now overshadowed by domestic disaster. How would he possibly survive these blows? John Constable had struggled to follow his dream of becoming an artist, and then finally with the Haywain, his fortunes seemed to have changed. After more than 2 decades of finding his art almost entirely unappreciated or rejected, by the 1820s, John Constable was enjoying a period of unanticipated artistic success. But this success didn't translate into hard cash, and it was followed by tragedy. The death of his much-loved wife, Maria, had left him a single father with 7 children dependent on him.
One of the unusual things about Constable He's one of the very few major artists who was a decent human being. He really was a good, affectionate, faithful husband and a very good and loving and dutiful father who did his best to bring up a large family of young children after Ra died on his own for the next decade.
He may never have had the huge financial success in England he deserved, but he did finally receive the recognition he'd so craved from the Royal Academy.
Constable is finally made a Royal Academician in 1829, over a quarter of a century after his rival Turner, for example. It's a very bittersweet occasion for him. Finally, he's got this professional endorsement he's worked so hard all his life to achieve, but it comes too late in order to be able to share it with his love.
And another, I think, greater accolade was to follow. When he was 56, the widowed Constable was on board a horse and carriage heading back to London from Suffolk.
He saw the countryside that he loved, and he just mentioned to his fellow passengers, "Oh, isn't it beautiful?" And a gentleman sitting near him on the carriage said, "But of course, it's Constable country." And you just have to imagine the poor man had been so melancholy, so depressed. It must have given him such a boost. He was delighted to know that he'd actually made a mark on people's psyches and people's attitudes towards what he loved as well.
John Constable died in 1837, and for such a devoted family man, it's fitting that he left most of his work to his daughter. She, in turn, bequeathed the paintings and sketches to the nation. They went on display in 1888 at the National Gallery, and that is when something quite extraordinary happened.
For the first time, people see his en plein air sketches. These very fresh, simple, beautiful studies made out of doors. And because of later movements like Impressionism, they now can judge these things and realise the value and the originality and innovations that Constable had brought to them. And Constable, in some ways, gets reinvented with definitely a sense of patriotic pride that actually here was Constable, the British artist, doing it a good 50 years before the French.
People flocked to see them because it was a sense of nostalgia. And also it was a bit of peace from the noise and the hubbub of city life. You know, they could lose themselves in the landscape, in nature.
And the biggest draw, obviously, was the Haywain.
It became instantly popular. It suddenly seemed to be a symbol of Britain in the British countryside. And in fact, it was so popular that by the 1890s, Thomas Cook had started to organise tourist visits to Constable country so that people could see where the Haywain was set.
You've got to remember that sort of in the 19th century, there were new trains taking people on trips around England. People wanted to go to Constable country.
It's still called Constable country today. And what's quite fascinating is that Constable really created a world that tourism then kept pristine.
The National Trust's Simon Peachy works as part of the team maintaining and preserving this iconic scene.
So if you walk this way, this is the Haywain view. Standing here, it's like stepping inside Constable's painting. So on the left-hand side, you've got Willie Lott's house, and you can see if the building is pretty similar today to how it was in Constable's time. You've got the mill pond right in front of you. And again, in Constable's painting, you've got the hay cart sitting in the middle of the mill pond. You've even got some oak trees. They're probably not the same oak trees that were there in Constable's time. But if you look through to the distance, that mass of trees, that's in exactly the same place as it was in Constable's time. So literally, standing here, you're stepping into his painting. You're almost walking in his footsteps.
Every year, 250,000 people come to admire the prospect that inspired Constable's Haywain all those years ago.
We like to say to visitors that we've got the original of the Haywain and the National Gallery has got the copy that was done by John Constable.
The landscape Constable painted is now an important part of the history of British art. But it's more than that. It's ingrained in our lives. It's so very familiar, an image found on countless calendars, biscuit tins, cushions and jigsaws in households all around the country.
John Constable has taken a sentimental rural vision and raised it to an ecstatic level. Yes, this bears no relationship to what was actually happening in Suffolk at the time. And yes, the more you think about it, it is an almost ridiculously banal image. It is the 1820s equivalent of a battered white van leaving a Tesco forecourt on its way to make a food delivery. This is John Constable gives you logistics solutions. And yet, when you look at it, it is impossible not to feel humbled and proud and very moved indeed. It is a golden age painting, full of the enjoyment of nature, fresh, delicious. You want to be there. You want to stand in that field and smell the wildflowers and feel the wind in your face as the clouds scud over your head. It is a deeply, deeply nostalgic painting, and nostalgia is a very powerful emotion. John Constable took the ordinary, the English ordinary, and he made it epic. He made it majestic. And by doing that, he touched the soul of the English forever. And that is why this is one of the world's great paintings.
Next time, an image that stirred passion and anger for nearly 400 years.
When it was made, this kind of image was outlawed, forbidden, and certainly never to be seen in public.
A groundbreaking work of rare beauty.
He's really fascinated by the whiteness or the paleness of her flesh. So it's quite a sexy picture.
That defied the Spanish Inquisition and roused the suffragettes into violent action.
What she had concealed about her person was some form of meat cleaver.
The remarkable story of the Rokeby Venus. These are the stories of 10 of the greatest paintings in the world. I'm Andrew Marr. Art, not politics, is the great passion of my life. For me, it gets to the heart of what it is to be human. In galleries across the globe,
there are great paintings, works made with almost supernatural skill, fierce passion, and extraordinary brain power.
Now I want to tell stories behind some of the most iconic images in history, pictures like Leonardo's Mona Lisa, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, paintings that represent the pinnacle of what people can do with paint and bristles.
He created a brand new way of depicting the world. The colours would fizz and pop on the surface.
It was like you could touch these people. It was like the portrait could speak to you.
Behind every picture, there is a story.
I'm going to peel back the layers to find out more about the lives of their creators and the worlds they came from.
There was something about this middle-class Florentine housewife that intrigued him.
Why are these the paintings we all know and love? How were they created? And what makes them the greatest paintings in the world?
All around the world, there are great galleries and museums crammed with beautiful art, which are open to everybody, free to all of us. Sometimes that's because of an act of national determination. Sometimes it's because of an individual bequest or legacy. When this one, Tate Britain, opened its doors first in 1897, it was the gift to the British of a Liverpool sugar merchant. Sir Henry Tate's great thing was sugar cubes, but his other great thing was British art, and he wanted to share his obsessive love of it with the rest of us.
Tate began this gallery with 65 of his own fine and memorable paintings, and at the heart of that collection there was one particularly special piece.
It's been famous since before the gallery was built, and it's still its most popular picture. The Victorians loved it, and so do we. It is luscious, gorgeous to look at, but this is not a pretty story. It's a young, disturbed woman's suicide by drowning. I'm talking, of course, about John Everett Millais' Ophelia.
You'd need to be a cold fish not to be moved. Simultaneously beautiful and deeply shocking, Ophelia is the crowning achievement of one of the most skilled and ambitious painters of Victorian Britain.
Millais was considered an absolute genius with a paintbrush. He could do almost anything. Flowers fresh, flowers drenched and drowning. Little touches of sunlight on leaves, a face perfectly rendered, wet hair sinking into the water.
Others had painted Ophelia before, but nothing like this. It isn't stagey or really melodramatic. Here is a real woman, briefly suspended in living water, almost ecstatic in her despair. So who was this doomed and dying figure? How was Ophelia captured on canvas, and why does this image still hold such an important place in one of the greatest art collections in the world?
To really understand this image, we have to go back to the very beginnings of its life, because behind the romantic scene lies a much darker and more revolutionary story.
It's a tale of a major artistic rebellion, of ruthless ambition and Victorian macabre. But before all of that, we start decorously in a far more conventional setting, just 2 miles from where Ophelia now hangs, in the place that mattered most to any aspiring Victorian painter, the Royal Academy of Arts. It was here, in December 1840, that an extraordinary young painter was first introduced to the Victorian art scene.
Millais was a child prodigy. He went to art school at a very young age, and he got into the Royal Academy when he was just 11 years of age.
He was the youngest ever person to attend the Royal Academy as a student. Prior to that, the youngest had been Turner, who went at the age of 14, which in itself was quite prodigious.
That's a record the young Millais still holds today. The Royal Academy was the only place to gain an art education. But to survive there, the young prodigy would have to bend himself to its rigor, its traditions, and above all, its taste.
You were told very much what you had to do, what paint palette you were allowed to use, what subject matter was appropriate for the stage of your learning.
You were meant to be painting portraits, landscapes, genre painting, often perhaps with some kind of moral tale.
Many artists were frustrated by the fact that the teachings of Joshua Reynolds, who died in 1792, were still being taught as the only way to look at art.
But even with these traditionalist teaching techniques, from the beginning, Millais' exceptional eye for detail, the very skill that would shine through in his Ophelia, won him fame and applause.
Millais was a great success at the Royal Academy. Even though he only went in when he was 11, he was winning awards and medals for his drawings and his paintings.
There's a wonderful picture of the Duke of Sussex handing the young Millais his silver medal, and he can hardly see Millais because he's so small. He has to bend down to this little boy who's shown with his lovely gold hairs and his little pantaloons.
Millais excelled at history paintings, big canvases depicting moral themes from well-known stories of the past. In 1846, he exhibited Pizarro seizing the Inca of Peru, and 1 year later, at just 18 years old, he received a gold medal for his painting The Tribe of Benjamin seizing the daughters of Shiloh. By the men at the top, he was adored, and yet, behind its closed doors, Millais was becoming increasingly frustrated with this cramping institution.
Revolutions in art tend to happen after a time of stagnation. And in the 1840s, British painting was frankly in a poor way. Most of the greats, including Constable, were dead. And apart from the elderly Turner, then thought to be in his decline, there was nobody for the young Millais to look up to, which was a great stroke of luck, because it meant he had to rely on his own resources, think harder, and make his own way. Well, I say his own way, but not entirely, because in a second stroke of luck, he was surrounded by a group of equally impatient and almost as talented friends.
Two other young artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Holman Hunt, shared Millais' frustrations with the revered Royal Academy.
They began to be rather critical. They felt that all the students were coming out and they were producing these rather brown, lacklustre paintings, which had no real connection to the society in which they were living.
Unlike all artists, they wanted to go their own way. They wanted to show their own talent.
So in 1848, the trio vowed to work together, igniting an extraordinary period of creativity.
Aged just 19 years old, the teenage Millais was about to transform the story of British painting forever.
And create an image that would shock the mid-Victorian establishment. John Everett Millais' Ophelia is one of the oldest and most popular pieces in Tate Britain's collection.
This painting is so photoreal, so throbbing with vivid, lush colour, that it's hard to remember it owes nothing at all to any camera or lens, but was painted meticulously by hand in the depths of Victorian London more than 150 years ago. It packs an immediate punch. It looks different because it was meant to look different. It was the product of an artistic plot or conspiracy, if you like, that shook the Victorian art world.
And it all began in the summer of 1848 in this small, nondescript house in central London, with three daring young chancers, all under the age of 22. John Everett Millais, William Holman Hunt, and the hot-headed, flashy painter and poet, Dante Gabriel Rossetti.
So these are young rebels. They want to cause a stir, a reaction, and they are defiantly rejecting what they had been taught by an older generation.
They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and even the name was a provocation. The now stale influence of the great Renaissance master Raphael was being cast off by the bold young radicals as a counter-revolution of spirituality based on naturalism now began.
It was very brave of the PRBs to do what they actually did, forming themselves and going against the Royal Academy, but they really believed in themselves.
These young artists who knew they were going to be provocative and they were going to be shocking to the public named themselves PRB, the little initials in the corner, so it's almost like a secret society.
A lot of academicians were really upset and they were quite shocked. You know, we've trained these students and this is what they're producing. They're rejecting us. These artists dismissing these time-honoured conventions of painting.
Within weeks, more like-minded young artists, fascinated by this radical new approach, joined Millais, Rossetti and Hunt. In their paintings, the rebellion unleashed an entirely new palette, paving the way for Millais' Ophelia.
The Pre-Raphaelite movement was revolutionary because their pictures just looked so different to everything else on display. The works were vivid and bright, with colours placed in juxtaposition.
They tried to show things as they really were. One of their tenets was truth to nature. So they would go outside, they would paint in the open air, and they would faithfully record everything that they saw. This was hugely radical.
So their pictures did actually look different, and they immediately demanded attention.
This revolutionary new society made their first big splash with Millais' attention-demanding Christ in the house of his parents. Now displayed in Tate Britain, it's one of the artist-educator Richard Thomas's favourite pieces.
It went on show at the Royal Academy annual exhibition in May 1850, and he was 20 years old, so this is his coming-of-age exhibition. The first thing that happened for people looking at it was that they were drawn into responding to the subject in the painting as if it was an incident in a perfectly ordinary carpenter's workshop. But that's not just a little boy who's cut his hand. This is the Holy Family with Mary, Jesus, and Joseph, and Mary's mother, St. Anne.
Everything about this painting reflected the new and almost extremist principles of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood.
Millais decided to paint the picture not in his studio, but on location in an actual carpenter's workshop in order to give the authentic feel. To get the effect of the vivid blood, Millais actually cut his own hand. You can see the chipped and dirty toenails of St. Joseph.
He thought this was one of his masterpieces. And until this time, Millais had been adored, so he didn't expect to really get a backlash. But in general, people took against this painting. One of the biggest problems was that Millais had portrayed the Holy Family as working class. This was really, really shocking to people. They didn't like it.
It's failing to do what people expect of a religious painting. It's failing to illustrate the sacred text. It's inserting an additional story. It's daring in a number of ways.
The Virgin Mary is not represented as some beautiful Raphaelesque type. She's shown as a woman who looks rather sort of haggard and grief-stricken. It would seem to be blasphemous.
Ignoring all the pallid Madonnas and cute Christs that had come before him, Millais' religious realism was entirely unexpected. The Victorians already had a mental image of the Holy Family, and they hadn't looked like this.
One of the biggest critics of this particular painting was Charles Dickens. Now, Dickens was not an art critic. However, he had an awful lot of sway.
And his criticism is utterly hostile. He describes the Christ child as a hideous, wry-necked, blubbering, red-headed boy with a bedgown. The Virgin is described as a kneeling woman so horrible in her ugliness that she would stand out from the rest of the company as a monster in the vilest cabaret in France or the lowest gin shop in England. So he's utterly dismissive of this coarse realism.
The Pre-Raphaelites may only recently have been founded, but thanks to Millais, their reputation was already shot to pieces. News of the scandal even reached Queen Victoria, who demanded to see Millais' blasphemous work for herself. The young artist was devastated.
After the shock of the reception of Christ in the house of his parents, Millais was determined to make the art world love him again, to get his reputation back. He wasn't going to compromise, but he was going to make sure that his next painting was adored.
And for that, there was no better place for Millais to turn than the theatre.
Theatre was very popular. When people went out for entertainment, they went to the theatre, and Shakespeare was extremely popular.
It was a bit of everything that the Victorians liked. There was death involved, there was love involved, a bit of almost eroticism.
The Victorian public adored their Shakespeare. Even those who couldn't read had been to the theatre and were well versed in his stories. So as the topic for story painting, Shakespeare was a shrewd choice, especially as Millais plucked out one of the most dramatic moments in one of the most popular plays of them all.
So this is the famous moment in Shakespeare's Hamlet when Hamlet's beloved Ophelia decides to kill herself. She has been driven mad because Hamlet appears no longer to love her and has been mocking her in a rather cruel way, and he has just killed her father. So for her, life is over.
It was a really popular subject with artists. A lot of artists known to Millais, Arthur Hughes, Richard Redgrave, had painted the death of Ophelia. But they'd done it in a picturesque way, where she's sort of just tripping over the bank and stepping into the water.
Millais, however, took a closer look at Shakespeare's immortal lines.
Her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like, a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old tunes as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto the element, but long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death.
Snatches of old songs, the waterlogged dress, inconsolable in her misery. Bound by the Brotherhood's rules, Millais wanted to bring all of this vividly to life. But to do that, he needed the perfect poor wretch, a model whose face he dearly hoped would become unforgettable. The answer to his Ophelia was a young hat seller called Lizzie Siddal.
Lizzie Siddal was working in a milliner's shop just off Leicester Square in London. And she was a rather unusual-looking woman for her time. She was a young woman who was very, very slim.
Long red hair, very pale skin, very tall. She was discovered by Millais' friend who went to the milliner's and saw her and just thought she'd be perfect for the Pre-Raphaelites. And she became their model. But she was also an artist in her own right.
She was quite intellectual and loved poetry, painting.
Rossetti loved her, Millais loved her. Everybody wanted to paint her.
She essentially became the Pre-Raphaelite supermodel.
Millais now had his Ophelia, but how would he transform a 22-year-old Victorian hat seller into his doomed Shakespearean? How could he bring his canvas to life unless his model lived and breathed her distress? Ophelia and her watery suicide had to feel real. It was the beginning of a painstaking process as carefully planned as any military maneuver.
It wasn't just the figure that was important, so like Ophelia. The background was just as important.
The scene in Hamlet takes place in a remote corner of Denmark, but Millais needed somewhere a little handier for central London. Today, his great-great-grandson, art historian Dr. Roger Bowdler, is retracing Millais' steps for the first time.
Oh, my goodness. It's just a fabulous feeling, actually, having found the precise spot where he spent weeks and weeks and weeks in the summer of 1851 painting Ophelia, and it's here. And this isn't the most romantic or glamorous of settings. You know, you can hear the M3 in the background, it's in the edge of Greater London, and it's covered in litter. But actually, that almost makes the magic of the picture the greater. The drama is about her imminent sinking below the water. So he doesn't want a grand, picturesque setting. He wants rather a modest riverbank to paint, and that's just what he finds.
To work outside, Millais capitalized on two exciting new innovations: small portable paint tubes and a host of new pigments and colors. His Ophelia would be the brightest canvas he'd ever produced, but working for so long outdoors still brought with it a whole catalogue of challenges.
He would spend up to 11 hours a day in great discomfort. He complained about the flies, about being threatened by a big bull.
He had farmers shouting at him. People would come past and ask him what he was doing.
And he has to deal with this pair of swans. They take up station just where he's found his spot and completely muck up the water weeds that he's so carefully selected for the setting of the painting.
Millais wrote, "My martyrdom is more trying than any I have hitherto experienced. Certainly, the painting of a picture under such circumstances would be a greater punishment to a murderer than hanging." These were the lengths the Pre-Raphaelites were willing to go to in order to capture nature as truthfully as possible.
He paints with fantastic finesse, which is why it takes him so long. So he begins work on this in early July. He's still here in early December.
He would say that it was like completing the size of a 5-penny piece each day. So that gives you a sense of how slow and gradual this process was.
He's putting his all into it because his reputation depends on success. So there's a discipline at work, along with the very romantic, poetic engagement of this poignant scene of watery death in this river.
But while Millais himself was more than happy to suffer for his art, even he realized that persuading Lizzie to dunk herself for hours in the cold and dirty waters of a Thames tributary might be going a little too far. And so back in central London, he came up with a somewhat less unpleasant alternative, but only somewhat.
Millais poses her in his studio, in his parents' house, in a bathtub, and he finds in an antique shop a beautiful antique dress with silver embroidery. Elizabeth Siddal is posed wearing this in the bathtub.
Now, Lizzie was being painted in December, long before central heating, and it was cold. It was in a basement studio. The lamps underneath the bath were kept lit in order to keep the water at an even temperature. But one day, Millais didn't notice that the lamps had gone out. The water, of course, just got colder and colder, and Lizzie lay there, the perfect artist model, suffering for his art as he completed his picture.
Millais' quest for realism had given his muse pneumonia. But although he was forced to pay for Lizzie's doctor's bills, there may have been a dark part of him that was quietly and privately pleased.
I think that the fact that Lizzie Siddal did suffer whilst posing did inject that extra sense of realism and naturalism to the face that he painted while she was lying there in the bath, freezing.
Millais had thrown everything at this piece, stretching himself to the limits of his already extraordinary abilities.
And yet it had almost cost the life of his model, and even after months of toil, he still wasn't finished. This was perhaps his last chance to not only save his reputation, but that of his fellow Pre-Raphaelites. So would his Ophelia be the great hit that Millais craved? John Everett Millais' Ophelia, the jewel in Tate Britain's collection, may be one of the most popular pieces of art of the 19th century, but it's definitely not for everyone.
There is something about this picture, perhaps its extreme prettiness, a dash of sentimentality that does not quite work for me. Perhaps I am already too old. That is, when I first started looking at paintings and loving paintings back in the 1970s, modernism was all the rage, and Victorian pictures telling stories were deeply unfashionable. But we all have to challenge our prejudices, don't we? And it may be strange thought, unlikely thought, that I am completely wrong.
And with this iconic canvas and its exquisite detail all to myself, it's very hard not to appreciate the sheer artistry.
So first of all, this is about two things for which the Pre-Raphaelites are very well known. Rich, luscious, almost enameled colour, and a detail so sharp you could cut your fingers on it. Where in the history of art have you ever seen a green as greeny as that green? Not since the very early Renaissance, I think. It is absolutely gorgeous, and the detail of the foliage is extraordinary. At times, he must have been using a brush with a single hair.
And so, yes, perhaps, I may have been a little hasty. Looking again with fresh eyes, the subject is creepy, but it's impossible not to admire the way Millais makes his colours glow and his brushes dance. A touch of blue here, a flicker of white there. He applies shades and highlights with nerveless accuracy.
He managed somehow, with the rest of the Pre-Raphaelites, to wash and rinse the colours so they glowed more freely and brightly than they had for a very, very long time. And they astonished the Victorians, and frankly, they are still astonishing us today.
There is this remarkable kind of hyper-real quality in the painting. And one of the ways he achieved this effect was to use a white ground, using lead white and zinc white. And the effect of that was to create this kind of backlit quality to these very bright primary colours that he's using.
And the wonderful passages of observation, there's two hands which will stand out like pieces of collage on the canvas. And it really conveys the impression of, this water just sinking into the dress. It's just dragging her bit by bit under the water.
The Pre-Raphaelites' hopes for a new art live in every inch of this canvas. It throbs with zest and confidence. It is everything the movement had hoped painting could be. It took Millais months, but finally, in early 1852, Ophelia was finished.
The question for Millais was now, was it worth it? Would the Victorian public feel half as strongly about this astonishing picture as did the artist himself?
When the painting went on display at the Royal Academy in 1852, there was a very mixed reaction, actually.
Some people thought it was a very unconventional representation of Ophelia. Someone described her death as if she were in a weedy ditch. Others felt it was just too bright, vivid and gaudy.
There was so much going on, so much symbolism, that viewers almost had to work at it. They had to study it really hard. And at first, people were a little bit shocked, but within a very short time, it was applauded.
People thought Millais has really captured something quite extraordinary. Tom Taylor, who wrote for The Times, when he saw the face of Ophelia, he just described himself as just crying with emotion because it made the death so beautiful.
Millais' masterpiece had been quickly snapped up by a private collector, but while it remained on public display, Ophelia proved to be a huge draw. And whether they liked it or not, the Royal Academy could no longer cast out its arrogant prodigal son.
The painting is really important in terms of Millais' career. It marks a watershed. Suddenly, his paintings become emotional, and he becomes seen as a painter of pathos and empathy. And there are accounts of people just become overcome with emotion at seeing Ophelia. And at that point, his reputation changes. And from this point onwards, it's really an upward trajectory.
Just a year after Ophelia was displayed, Millais was chosen as an Academy Associate, an act which would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. The establishment he had rejected and which had loudly rejected him was suddenly embracing the stiff-backed young radical. But if Ophelia had been about tapping into popular taste, then, unfortunately, Millais now didn't know when to stop.
So from 1853 onwards, Millais starts to feel that he doesn't have to stick entirely to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's principles. He sticks to a lot of them, but he starts to experiment.
He becomes a highly successful commercial artist, a painter of genre scenes, of landscapes. His style relaxes, but also I think he becomes just bored, dissatisfied with that Pre-Raphaelite, very finicky manner. He wants to develop as an artist. Artists always have to change and evolve.
He became a fashionable portraitist, painting rich people's portraits, and a lot of artists said that he sold out, but he was making a living.
Most of the public just loved him. They couldn't get enough of Millais. He started to paint a lot of crowd-pleasing pictures, often of little children, because that was the fashion.
He becomes the darling of the British public.
A revolutionary no longer, Millais' later work, which even included a saccharine advert for Pear's soap, bore no relation to his Pre-Raphaelite canvases. He became firmly part of the establishment. In 1896, aged 67, he was even elected Royal Academy President. But whereas Ophelia had once represented the peak of the Pre-Raphaelite movement in all its non-conformist glory, now it marked the beginning of their demise. Holman Hunt and the increasingly eccentric Rossetti would be left to forge their own paths, and their great muse Lizzie, immortalized in their paintings, would begin a terrifying parallel trajectory in real life. Millais' painting had almost killed her, and now she was going to become Ophelia-like in an entirely new way.
People clamoured to come and see this painting. And in fact, for Lizzie Siddal, in some ways, it was a double-edged sword. She became very famous because of it.
Through her association with Rossetti, she really begins to pick up her art again, painting and drawings, often portraying scenes of lovers or couples in complicated psychological situations. She also starts to write her own poetry and verse.
Lizzie was a sophisticated Pre-Raphaelite artist in her own right, much more than the model in the movement's most iconic piece. But her relationship with Rossetti was incredibly tempestuous. He was a serial cheat, and Lizzie didn't make the easiest partner herself.
Perhaps the biggest problem in their relationship on her side was that she was a laudanum addict. And laudanum was an opiate. It was opium in alcohol, incredibly addictive. And it was a real social ill of the 19th century, particularly amongst women.
Depressed, unappreciated, and darkly miserable, Lizzie could not control her addiction. And tragically, on the 11th of February 1862, aged just 32, she killed herself with a suspected overdose.
People have often associated the tragic early death of Elizabeth Siddal with the early death of Ophelia. So there is this conflation between art and life. That's what's so sort of magical and sort of, slightly sort of sinister or uncanny about Pre-Raphaelite paintings. Often art and life do converge.
When Lizzie was buried, Rossetti did a very romantic gesture. He placed in her coffin, between her cheek and her hair, his only copy of his poems that he'd written. He claimed that they were all about her, that love had died with her. He was deeply grief-stricken.
With Ophelia sold and in private hands, the Pre-Raphaelites disbanded, and Millais now creating mainstream art for the masses, it looked as if the importance and significance of this remarkable painting would start to fade.
But neither Lizzie Siddal nor Millais' Ophelia were going to be forgotten, because something was about to happen in that graveyard which would lodge the young model and the painting deep in the Victorian popular imagination.
Millais' great canvas, Ophelia, has continued to capture our imagination almost 170 years since it was first exhibited. And I think that's in part because its subject matter transcends any age or any era.
There is no moment in the human story so cold, so lonely, and so bleak as deciding to take your own life. Ophelia killed herself because she had been so badly betrayed she was demented. And she did it in a particularly grim way.
But what also added to the intrigue, mystery, and perhaps the popularity of this canvas was that it was an act reflected by the untimely death of Millais' own muse. And Victorian Britain would be aghast at what happened next.
Lizzie Siddal was buried in Highgate Cemetery, Rossetti's handwritten poetry tucked neatly behind her long flowing red hair. But this tragic woman was not going to be allowed to rest in peace, because just 6 years later, Rossetti decided that he wanted his poetry back, which was tricky, because he could hardly dig her up again. Or could he? By 1869, Rossetti couldn't bear the thought of his Pre-Raphaelite poetry being lost to the world any longer. And so alongside his friend Charles Augustus Howell, he hatched a macabre plan to retrieve the poems from Lizzie's grave.
They'd done it by bonfire light, and the coffin had been exhumed and the lid had been taken off, and allegedly, according to Howell, there was Lizzie perfect. She wasn't a skeleton, she was miraculously preserved. He claimed that her hair had grown so much it filled the whole coffin. Rossetti wanted to believe it, that Lizzie was the beautiful supermodel in death, just as she'd been in life.
Rossetti published the poems, which he'd received with a wormhole running through them. They didn't go down well. By the time he died 13 years later, he was a thin spectre of the man who'd helped found the Pre-Raphaelites back in 1848. And yet, a mythology began to grow around the image of Lizzie, captured for eternity as the epitome of the betrayed woman.
She's sort of a heroine for women that suffered at the fate of drugs and men and being a muse.
A lot of women now model themselves on Elizabeth Siddal, and the Elizabeth Siddal look is now rather fashionable. If you think of performers such as Florence Welsh with the red hair, pale complexion, the flowing garments.
Perhaps one reason why Lizzie Siddal still captures the imagination is that her own suicide is so neatly captured in the painting of her by Millais as Ophelia. The fact that she was the most famous suicide in art history and then becomes a suicide in real life is something that continues to resonate with people.
There's no denying this is a great Victorian horror story. But Lizzie Siddal, the face of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, should not be remembered just as a beautiful victim.
We look at Lizzie Siddal in this picture, and she is entirely passive, almost surrendered. And we have to remember that this was a woman who, in her real life, was an artist and a writer, a poet herself. It is a great, great injustice that the way we remember her is only as a passive, sinking woman in a famous painting and as a corpse being ravaged for somebody else's poetry long after her death.
And yet, even now, Lizzie couldn't quite rest in peace. The painting of Ophelia had vanished into the private art world not long after it had been completed. But now it had reached the eye of one very important man.
In 1892, Henry Tate purchases the picture. Henry Tate is a sugar magnate. He's made his fortune from sugar refining. He patents the sugar cube.
There was only one thing that Tate loved more than sugar: art, and in particular, Pre-Raphaelite art. Over the last few years, he'd collected an extraordinary number of paintings. And now, he wanted to share them with the nation.
He loved the idea of a national gallery that people of all social classes could go to.
A site is decided upon, which is the old Millbank Penitentiary. It's a site which will be transformed into this public gallery, which will be free of charge for the public, particularly for the working poor of the Millbank area.
A cutting-edge art gallery in one of the poorest areas of the city. That was a mighty risk. The question on everyone's lips was, would Ophelia help pull in big crowds? And the answer was a resounding yes.
The gallery opens in 1897, and Ophelia is an immediate hit with the public. People flock to see it.
It was one of those that people were told to sort of stand back, don't jostle. They had to have a lot of guards checking that people didn't get too close to the painting, and it's remained one of the most successful paintings of the Tate ever since.
This haunting canvas has spoken to generation after generation since it was first hung here more than 120 years ago.
Millais' Ophelia is a masterwork by a master painter. He was a young revolutionary taking on the establishment, and then, very quickly, the perils of success. He became the establishment himself, and he was much mocked for turning out cute, sentimental pictures, some of them used in advertising as sweet as any sugar cube manufactured by Sir Henry Tate himself. But this here still shows all his defiance and his optimism. It is a young man's shout hanging on these establishment walls. No, I still don't love it, but I salute it for its vividness and its energy. And anyway, Ma, you old fool, the rest of the world disagrees.
Next time.
This was a painting that was not supposed to be seen by the public. It was private art, strictly for behind closed doors.
The story of a ravishing beauty and the revolution she stirred.
He would have put it on the bonfire and watched it burn.
This could only be Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus.